Loves you and is watching. So.
Welcome back. Some of the most fascinating stories on Midday have come about through phone calls and letters we receive, and we have such a story today. A guest who phoned us has now suddenly discovered she has 3 sisters and a brother living in Los Angeles that she didn't know anything about. Please welcome singer Sharyn Crystal. We'd like to explore your story today. Let's go back 5 years ago. You were with your mother on a cruise and a very big conversation took place. What happened? What did she tell you?
Well, my mother had a very hard time with me, and all I needed to know was who my father was. My mother was very, very hurt because he was an American serviceman and he promised to marry her and he didn't come back. And so my mother found it very difficult to talk about this. She was heartbroken. And I finally, over many drinks, we had a chat, and I asked her if she would tell me my father's name, I would leave it alone. And so she did.
This is only 5 years ago.
Yes.
You grew up never knowing the identity of your father. What were you told?
Basically that he was an American serviceman and he had died.
Mm-hmm. What are your earliest memories of childhood?
Missing my mum, really missing my mother. I was, from birth, I stayed with some friends of my mother. The reason why is because my mother lived with her mother, and her mother really couldn't deal with the fact that her beautiful daughter had this child. And in those days, the stigma attached to having a child without marriage was bad enough, let alone having a child of Afro-American descent. And my grandmother was basically very embarrassed. She was embarrassed. And
so you didn't live with your family, your mother, for the first 5 years of your life?
First 12 years of my life.
Mm-hmm. You then, at 5, though, went to boarding school?
That's right. I was with the nuns, the Sisters of St. Joseph, and I stayed there until I was 12, but somewhere along the line I decided that I really needed to be with my mother. And the only way that was going to happen was I decided to run away from the boarding school. And if I ran away often enough, I knew I'd be expelled. And that's what I did. And
you had contact with your mother through that whole time?
All the time. My mother used to come every Sunday and take me out, and we had some lovely days together, but I never went to her home. And it was just a very, very hard time for my mum. But her and I, we had a lovely time together. But I needed to be with her. Yeah.
When you arrived at 12 to your mother, who was living with her mother, so you went to your grandmother's house, what was life like for you?
My grandmother was a very interesting woman. She was a very old-fashioned, very much a true blue Aussie. She had very high principles and high morals, and she really told me point blank that I had possibly was the worst thing that ever happened to my mother. And she was never cruel, but she was very distant. But strangely enough, her and I had a relationship. We had a very interesting relationship because I knew that the only way I was going to be able to stay with my mother was to have a relationship with this lady. That are just wonderful. So yeah, it was okay. Ask her to tell me about her life, and it was very, very interesting. So I would brush her hair. She had long silver hair, and I'd brush her hair and she'd tell me the story of her life, and it was very, very interesting. So we got to be quite close, but you know, it was hard for her too. What
sort of acknowledgement did you have from within the family at 12, going to live through those teenage years?
Oh, my cousins. I have a whole lot of cousins that are just wonderful. So yeah, it was okay. It was okay.
But how were you explained?
I was explained to my immediate family as our little friend from America. To visitors that came to my grandmother's house, I wasn't there. I mean, I just wasn't introduced to visitors at all.
Because your mother is blonde?
Yes, she is.
Blue-eyed?
Yeah.
So you certainly weren't fitting into the family picture portrait?
Not at all, no.
So when you were told that your father was dead, when finally you learned his name, what did you do?
I immediately went down to the Maritime Archives building, which is in Sydney, and I had to go back through till 9 months before I was born, to February 1948, to find out what ships were in Sydney at that time, American ships. And then when I found the American ships, which was quite a task because there were so many ships in Sydney at that time. But anyway, then I would go through the crew list. And then I finally, after many, many hours, found my father's name. And it was joyous. It was great. Then I got in touch with a missing persons bureau in Texas, and the gentleman there discovered that my father had passed away in 1981. So I thought that was it. I thought that was the end of the line. That was probably one of the saddest days of my life, because I thought then I'd never have the knowledge of finding out my American history. And that's where I thought it would end.
But not so, because you then realised that in America you have some half-brothers and sisters.
Yes, very much so. A friend of mine went to Los Angeles, Brian, and he well, my question to him was, would he go to the cemetery and see if there were names on the headstone? And he didn't have any luck there. So what he did was he went to my father's last known address, and he met the lady next door who knew the family very, very well. And then about a month ago or so, I was sitting at home, Brian came to visit, and I said, oh, how was your trip to Los Angeles? And he said, go to the telephone. He says, a lady called Deborah who wants to speak with you. And I said, why? And he said, she's your sister. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was wonderful. And I spoke to Deborah, and she told me that I have our 3 sisters and my brother. And
were they aware of you?
No, not at all. Not at all. And they are so beautiful, Kerri-Anne. They are just beautiful.
And you're planning on visiting?
Yes, I'm going in November. I'm going to meet them mid-November in Los Angeles.
So you've had telephone calls and...
Oh, huge telephone calls, yeah.
And you're visiting in November.
Yes.
Well, Sharyn, you're going to stay with us because you're going to sing for us today. Sisters Incorporated is the name of your group. So, in fact, we'll take a break at this point and we'll come back with more of Sharyn and also some great singing. Stay with us.